It's Thursday, December 17th, and welcome to a very special state of the game for Dark Age of Camelot. I'm Ramek, and today we're talking about some significant changes to keeps, RVR, Midwinter, and even some new Mithril items available from the Mithril store. So we spent a lot of time on this channel talking about how Broadsword could shape the future of RVR as a game and as the population evolves. It ebbs and it flows. So first, let's kind of recap to what brought us here. Large daytime battle groups attacking other realms with little to no organized defense. This isn't really the only reason, but it's one of the big ones, so let's dive into that. The problem, at least to me, is twofold. Albion is void of regular battle group leaders during EU prime time, so the remaining players struggle to build a response when keeps are under siege. That's one. Two is that Hibernia's EU primetime BG leader Hororius is known for using this to his advantage and turning entire realms green with very little pushback because of problem one. Now, up until a couple of years ago, keeps, even empty of opposing players, were a huge source of realm points, and part of what propelled some HIB players to the highest realm ranks in the game. Broadsword changed this in 1.121 by introducing the individual contribution system, which tied the amount of player versus player action inside of a keep to how many realm points were earned, also giving defenders realm points for showing up and trying to fight, even if they ultimately lost. It's my belief Broadsword did this in an attempt to try and curb the trend of empty keep taking. And as the population changed and battlegroup tactics evolved, the changes introduced in 1.121 have become less effective. Today, there is a major announcement and rollout of some new game mechanics involving keeps that Broadsword hopes will recenter game balance and new frontiers. So here's a quick overview of what we know so far. Climbing spikes, which are traditionally given to tanks that otherwise would not have stealth and the climb ability, the reuse time has gone up to 180 seconds. These tanks will also be vulnerable to additional damage once they've used those climbing spikes and are now inside of the keep fighting. So that helps deal with some of the defenders being able to output additional damage in hopes of trying to take some of those tanks that are pushing in down. There's also a second component of this, which is the protection obelisk. And this obelisk spawns when a friendly player in a friendly keep buys an item from a merchant inside of the inner. And that item costs 50,000 bounty points. They hand that item back to the merchant and it spawns this protection obelisk. So what does the obelisk do? The obelisk provides a 50% reduction in damage, both physical damage and magic damage, to players that are inside of the Lord Room, that are up on the roof, and this also applies to players that are on the inner oil. So essentially anything above the floor of the Lord Room up and out, right? Just inside that inner structure. Soon as players leave that area, they lose the buff. So if they go down towards the balcony, they lose it. If they jump out, they lose it. So here's the catch. If you end up using the obelisk, you go up to the Lord and you receive this 50% damage reduction buff. And again, it's both physical and magical damage. There is one thing that can happen that can ruin all of that. The group or the BG, whatever it is that's attacking that comes through the inner, can take that obelisk down. That obelisk is located on the first floor of the inner. So it's technically a mob, and it can be meleeed down or PBA'd down. It can be killed just like anything else in the game. And the second that obelisk is brought down, it means that the buff that's protecting the people in the Lord Room, the roof, and the outer oil, it drops. And that obelisk has to be essentially repurchased and reused by the NPC on the ground floor. So those are some of the changes. In addition to the Midwinter event that's dropping with all of the fun festive stuff, there's a new Santa hat that's coming in that I'm super excited about. But here to discuss some of these additional changes that are being brought in is Leegen. And Leegen is, as you know, the mid-BG leader who runs during US primetime and also during EU primetime. Leegen, good to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
So tell me, based on what you've heard so far, tell me a little bit about what you think. Maybe we'll start with the climbing spikes. What do you think that means for tanks that are pushing inside of the inner?
So I mean, let's face it too. Like this reuse time increase, I do like it. Take it for somebody who plays a warrior. I don't really use my climbing spikes all that much anyway. I prefer to be on the outside. Trying to get the doors open. So I don't necessarily use the climbing spikes per se. So it doesn't really affect me too much. But from a defensive side, like if I'm defending a keep, I like this use or this change. It's a good change. It really helps out too because when you're on the defensive side too, oftentimes you're caster heavy. So having a bunch of like heavy tanks in your face on the wall is usually not fun.
Right.
So I do like this only because it delays the reuse. Like if they start taking too much damage on the wall, they jump off. They don't necessarily take a whole lot of falling damage, and then by that point anyway, the climbing spikes are up, and then they're going to another location to climb back into the keep. So I like it. I think it's a good change. I think this is gonna really be useful. For future defenses down the road.
What do you think of that damage increase that's afforded to the defenders against those tanks that are using climbing spikes trying to get inside of the keep?
So that's really gonna make these tanks really think twice before they climb into these keeps. If you don't have enough climbers, like if you don't have enough tanks with you, it kind of defeats the purpose of climbing in. Because if you're like 3 tanks to like 2 groups of casters that are just sitting there blasting at you, it doesn't really help out for you to be inside. So, and one of the benefits too, for those climbers is they're climbing in, they're trying to clear off the walls, they're trying to break down outer oil, trying to get into these defensive locations or for inside the keeps. So I think that this is going to help. At least for the defender, though, but it's really going to make those climbers and people who have the ability to climb in really consider what they're doing and make them think twice first before they actually pop those climbing spikes and just climb in aimlessly. It's going to be more of a strategic gameplay, a more strategic move, if you will, than just blindly going up and seeing what's in there.
Based on what we talked about with the obelisk, Leegen, what do you think the advantage and maybe the disadvantage for players that are, and maybe we can talk a little bit about underpopulated battle groups or defenders, how that obelisk might change the keep dynamics and the gameplay inside of the inner once that door is down?
So here's the benefit, at least for the defenders, right? So those that are on the upper level are going to be receiving these buffs, including those that are out on the inner oil. That is nice for them to be able to defend the inner and try to keep that oil up as long as possible. Because if there's climbers that are up and they lock down the inner oil, you basically lose a vital piece of your defense at that point. To be able to have that oil to pour when they go to push into through the inner door. So having that buff benefits there. However, once that door is open, it's null and void at that point. That buff is gone. There's nothing there anymore. Anymore. It will no longer benefit you. So if you're pushing in from the inner or into the inner door, and your BG that's defending is on that balcony, you're not receiving the buff. The problem is that if you don't go in there and you go upstairs into the Lord room anyway, you have the buff until that piece is broken, which is also in a not so great location, I'm going to say, because it's not easily to defend that spot. Because if you're downstairs in the balcony and trying to defend with this obelisk, you're not getting the buff. But if you go up to the Lord room where the buff is, you pretty much have given up that obelisk. So I don't necessarily agree in its placement. I believe that this should be reassessed on where it currently sits, to be able to provide that benefit for the BG. But at the same time, I kind of see too like what their intentions were to be able to not have that 50% buff in places like pushing into like the Lord Room, if you will,
Right.
to be able to like void that out. I get it, but I feel like this obelisk should be reevaluated in what it should do. I don't necessarily agree with the 50% protection. Like it's great that it's doing it for inner oil, but you're talking about one part.
Sure.
Um,
And I think it
I
depends
feel
too on the difficulty of the obelisk, right? Whether it is, and we're recording this at a stage where we actually don't know, other than testing, essentially what this obelisk in terms of its resiliency, the amount of hit points it has, the amount of damage that can be done to it, how many people you need in order to be able to take it down. That's all subject to change. So this thing could ultimately, when it goes live, it could be it could be substantially harder. But I can understand what you're saying, right? That it's, if you've got a 60-70% BG that's pushing into that ground floor and they're able to take that obelisk down, it almost negates the purpose of it in the first place. So I think we're going to kind of have to see what Broadsword does from the point that they launch this and they push it live as they evaluate over the course of time.
right. Because I mean, you and I both know during those keep defenses anyway, the best spot to defend that inner is gonna be that balcony. It's a good spot to really defend an incoming BG that's coming through that bottom door or that inner door. So if you don't do that, obviously you're not going to have the buff, and you are giving, if you don't do that, you're giving up like half that real estate right there to be able to like half that ground to defend. And in keep fights especially, every inch matters. Trying to hold them at the door or the hole, whatever they break, whatever that they get into the courtyard, trying to hold that courtyard, and then holding the inner. Because at least from like my perspective, anyway, once you get pushed into the Lord Room, it's really difficult to survive and successfully defend once you're pushed all the way into that room.
Right.
It's really difficult, and by leaving the obelisk in its current placement, and you lose that buff, if you will, if you lose that piece, you're losing so much real estate by not defending that balcony. But again, you're on the balcony and defending, but then you're not getting the buff. But then once you fall back to the room anyway, they kill the obelisk and the buff's gone. So is it really benefiting? I don't think so.
I think if anything, it will. So depending on the difficulty of it, right? It could help. It could help realms that maybe don't, or groups that aren't properly formed, that don't have group composition, that or don't have a good group composition, that don't maybe have heals. If it's smaller fights versus smaller fights, right?
Right.
The other thing that's interesting, I didn't mention before or failed to mention, is that you can in fact heal it and buff it. So it is a mob, but it is a friendly mob to the realm that owns the keep. So you can in fact on the balcony, if there's a healer on the balcony, you can in fact cast down on the obelisk and heal the obelisk as it's taking damage. Again, though, I think it very much depends on the strength of the obelisk, how many hit points this thing has. All of that stuff is still, I think, TBD. So.
Right. So I don't know. I see its benefit, but I don't see it in as great of a scale as I would like it to be. And I like the idea, though. I think that having this thing is more of like an objective, right? It's more of like a goal, like something to reach when you are pushing into these keeps and trying to defend these keeps. Of like, okay, say if there's one out in the courtyard, even, if I take my BG and I push in and I get the courtyard, I break that piece that's in the courtyard. That buff's gone, but I feel like that should also give the attackers somewhat of a benefit too. Something small. I'm not talking massive like this one. Like 50% damage reduction is pretty big.
Yeah.
Um, but to have those scattered about in key areas of like the keep would be beneficial and really encourage more keep fights rather than just straightforward break through the wall, push the break the inner door, push up, and then kill the lord, and then the fight's over pretty much at that point.
Yeah.
I think that would encourage more fighting there in certain areas more rather than just like the key areas. But I do see the benefit though of it on the inner oil. But you're talking one key location out of the entire keep.
And the roof, right? But
And
it's
the
true.
roof.
But it's true that I think the idea was to give those defenders in certain spots where I think they tend to be more vulnerable. We've talked about this on the State of the Game before, where I think there's a large number of players that don't really keep their line of sight in check. They give up their back way too often on places like the roof, and the oil, I think, as well. But it for me, it's really more about the inner oil and the roof than it is the Lord Room, and it's almost more about being able to hold a courtyard, than it really is being able to deal with an inner. Or being able to deal with folks once they're in the inner, especially if it's a large Zerg versus a small number of people. I don't think it's as advantageous at that point. Also, the cost is 50,000 bounty points, so people have to take that into consideration as to whether it's worth the investment.
Right, and for the defenders anyway. For the casters primarily here, right? All the ranged attack. Those individuals are going to be sitting on that roof now pretty heavily, right? At least until that door is open. So that's going to benefit them, and it's going to give them at least a little bit of an incentive too of, all right, I'm going to take 50% less damage up on the roof. Where are the enemies casters going to be sitting at, which is typically on a close by tower, so they can shoot at people that are up on the roof.
Absolutely.
So that's really going to give them more of a reason now to be up there. The thing though that I can see happening though is if, for example, I push in from the outer door of say Enget, right? Is anybody actually going to be set up to try and hold the courtyard for them, or are all the casters and everybody else just going to be sitting up on the roof and just waiting at that point?
Doesn't do them a ton of favors though to just be sitting on the roof. I think it's
right.
It doesn't really help them, especially casters that don't have bolt range anything. It makes it more difficult.
It does, but on certain locations though, like I could stack up casters, do like an energy train on top of the inner oil, like the left side of it anyway, because that should be in range for bolts to hit the outer door when you push in.
Sure.
So kind of benefits them anyway, at least for like that courtyard engagement there. But yeah, I can see it now too of like, all right, well now everybody that's up on the roof is going to take a 50% less damage though. But how many of those individuals are actually going to be inside of the keep at one time? Like, let's say if you look at like EU Prime, for example, like mid BG doesn't have that many people defending some days, versus like something like Heroes BG where it's 50-60 plus during the day. So how much of a benefit is it going to be for those individuals to receive that 50% damage reduction? Are they going to be able to do much up there rather than taking 50% less damage? That's right. my whole thing. Is, are they going to be able to successfully is this going to give them like an edge, I should say, or a chance there to be able to defend against a much larger force? and that's something that we'll have to see as time goes by too, and see how this is gonna change up those fights during EU Prime, especially because during US Prime we don't fight in keeps usually. It's usually a bunch of open field fights or fights in EV in the towers or KM even. These keep fights are not really going to be really be driven on US Prime. It's usually EU Prime. So we'll have to see how this goes for the next few weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I of course, I don't work for Broadsword. I'm not affiliated with Broadsword, but I do think that they have a very open mind. They understand. It's obvious that they understand the issue at hand, which is trying to balance out some of these fights where there's either a much larger BG where people aren't coming out and defending, or trying to balance some of that inner keep fighting. They want to do this, it seems, because they're working on this obelisk. They've done all this stuff for climbing spikes, and I think they do have an open mind. And this may not be the last thing that we see in terms of changes to keep dynamics. I don't know of any roadmap, but if you're watching this, or if you're reading the patch notes and you're going, they could have done X or Y. My suggestion would be patience, because it's more than what we had yesterday. And, there could be something that comes along in the future that they either change the way this works, they could pull it out, they might improve on it, they might expand upon it. The game is not in a situation as it was 10 years ago, where there were thousands of people, or even 1,000 people, that were willing to go over to Pend and do QA testing and test patches. So this kind of stuff, unfortunately, I think has to, at least it can be tested and bug tested on Pend, but and in the internal servers, but to be able to see how it actually plays out with the live population, this is something that's a work in progress that Broadsword knows they have to push out and just kind of test the waters and see what happens. So if you're looking at this and saying this isn't enough, I would say be a little more optimistic, because they've done this, and I don't think they've said that this is going to be the end all be all. I think there's actually, if there is room to improve, they will. So that makes me excited.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that they're even making these changes right now, it just shows that Broadsword is acknowledging the fact that something needs to change.
Yep, I agree with you, and they're acting upon it. All right, well, that wraps up this special edition of the State of the Game. Normally we do these Tuesday night at 10 p.m., but on a patch day, Midwinter's dropping. There's a new Santa hat. There's bonuses on Uane, bonuses I think on Geharis too, and then these changes. I figured we'd do a special edition, and the first person that came to mind to talk to is Leegen, of course, who leads the mid BG most nights, and then sometimes during the day, during EU Prime time as well. You've done a pretty great job over there rallying the troops. So,
thank you.
Thanks for joining me. I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me.
If you want to hear more DAoC State of the Games, we've got a whole archive of them available on YouTube, also in your favorite podcast app. Yep, this is a podcast. You might actually be listening to this as a podcast. All you have to do is type in DAoC State of the Game, and you can download it. You can subscribe and get updates on the go as soon as new episodes are posted. Until next time, be safe, wear a mask, and we'll see you out there on the battlefield.